Chapter 61 Sea of Ash. In the morning, Sunny woke up feeling grim and uneasy. The memory of the frightening dark mirror was still fresh in his mind, making every shadow seem sinister and foreboding. He scowled sullenly. What the hell? I'm the child of shadows. Why do I have to be afraid of my own domain? But then again, darkness and shadow were not the same, even if a lot of people tended to mistake one for another. Shadows were born from the absence of light. In a sense, they were manifestations of emptiness. True darkness, on the other hand, true darkness was its own entity. In a sense, shadows shared more in common with light than they did with darkness. I guess they do. Do they? Philosophical debates with his internal monologue were not the best way to start the day, at least as far as Sunny was concerned. His already sour mood only got worse. With a short sigh, he sat up and stretched his arms, yawning. Good morning. The sound of his voice was almost drowned by the echoing noise of rushing water. With the sun rising, the dark sea was in a hurry to retreat. Sunny was finally able to relax a little. Morning. Nephis had been guarding the camp during the latter part of the night, so she was already awake. As usual, she was meditating with her eyes closed, in the absolute darkness of the night, watching over. Something actually meant listening for suspicious sounds, so keeping one's eyes open was not that useful. For everyone except Sunny, that is, who had perfect night vision thanks to his attributes. Hearing him stand up, Changing Star slowly opened her eyes. A soft afterglow left behind by the dancing white flame could still be seen in their depth, quickly disappearing as her sight adjusted to the twilight of dawn. She looked at Sunny and offered him a polite smile. In the past 2 weeks, Nephis had also been training, perhaps even more diligently than him. However, she wasn't trying to improve her swordsmanship. She was actually trying to learn how to behave like a normal human. As the result, their interactions had become slightly less awkward, for the most part. Sunny was able to recognize Changing Star's efforts because they were very similar to a phase he himself had gone through many years ago. On several occasions, he had caught her intently observing how Cassie talked and behaved around them. Sometime later, Neph would randomly try to mimic small details of her friend's behavior. The results were a mixed bag, to say the least. The first time she tried to greet him with a smile in the morning, Sunny panicked and almost summoned the Azure Blade. However, Nephis was very smart and persistent. Today, her polite smile looked almost natural. He had no idea why Changing Star decided to work on her social skills, of all things, during their perilous journey through the monster-infested hellscape that was the Forgotten Shore. But he didn't mind. It was actually rather entertaining to watch. Watching her torture herself every day, enduring terrible pain in hopes of learning to better control her aspect ability, on the contrary, was not fun at all. They never talked about it, but Sunny knew that every time Nephis pretended to meditate, she was actually subjecting herself to the excruciating agony of her flaw. When he thought about it, his heart ached. Sunny wasn't used to feeling such things, but he suspected that this was what other people called compassion. At least it was similar to how it was described in books and dramas. Not that he knew a lot about that stuff. After they had breakfast, Nephis stood up and looked at the beam of light falling through the nearest gap between giant vertebrae. Turning to Sunny, she said, "Let's study the surroundings." They needed to get the lay of the land and decide on their next step. Usually, that implied looking for the nearest natural features that were high enough to stay above the surface of the sea and deciding on which one they would try to reach next. Then came a day or two of scouting and hunting, followed by moving the camp to that feature. Sunny gave her a nod. All right. He summoned the Echo to guard Cassie while they were away and left the Shadow behind to keep an eye out, just in case something happens. Then Sunny followed Nephis to the gap. Boosting her, he watched as Changing Star flew through the air and then seemingly ran up the wall, kicking herself off at the last moment, and propelling her body even higher before grabbing onto a bone protrusion. Relying only on her upper body strength, she then climbed up and disappeared into the cascading light. Soon, the golden rope fell down, allowing him to follow. Nephi's helped him climb atop the gargantuan spine and then straightened, turning to take a look west. Sunny shook his hands and did the same, expecting to see the usual picture, an endless expanse of the crimson labyrinth, dotted here and there with rare high points. However, what they saw left them both speechless. Some distance away, the labyrinth seemed to lose color. The crimson blades of coral stood gray and misshapen, as though struck by some unknown disease and drained of all life. The stone-like material looked brittle and fragile, ready to crumble to dust at any moment. The patch of dead coral spread for as far as the eye could see. Further away, the walls of the labyrinth seemed to have collapsed into a sea of ash-gray sand. This ashen wasteland looked so alien and strange after weeks of seeing only the endless crimson pathways that Sunny felt a shiver run down his spine. The fact that they didn't notice even a single monster moving through the mud beneath made him feel even more disturbed. There was only one visible high point to the west of them. Far away into the distance, the ground rose, forming a tall hill. The hill was probably the largest they had seen, easily capable of becoming a real island once the water rose in the night. Its shape reminded Sunny of a colossal barrow. Covered in the gray sand left behind by dead coral, the hill resembled a mountain of ash. That mountain was crowned by a giant tree. The tree rose into the sky like a tower, its branches wide enough to cover the whole island in their shade. The bark of the giant tree was as black as the water of the dark sea, while its leaves were red as blood. Contrasted against the gray sky, the crimson crown of the majestic tree looked incredibly vibrant and magnificent. Sunny gulped. "What the hell is that?" Nephis was either thinking or had nothing to say. She just stared into the distance, a slight frown on her face. At that moment, something glistened brightly from beneath the tree. The glimmer was clear and easily visible even from their position, like a beam of sunlight reflected by a large mirror. A moment later, it was gone, only to appear again after a few seconds. A mirror. Sunny shivered, remembering the previous night. For some reason, the bright glimmer suddenly seemed to become menacing. After some time had passed, he addressed Neph again. "What do you think?" She lingered a bit before turning to him. While Changing Star was deliberating on what to say, he glanced at the ashen wasteland again. Finally she spoke. "This is the only way west." Sunny grimaced and looked away. He didn't like this turn of events one bit. "So we are going?" Nephis turned to face the giant tree and, as though affected by its grandeur, hesitantly shrugged. "Do we have a choice?" Some time later, they abandoned the remains of the giant sea monster and moved west, planning to check the situation inside the wasteland that lay between them and the Ashen Barrow. Initially, they weren't planning to approach the strange island. However, things turned out to be rather unusual once they entered the wasteland. With gray sand under their feet and dead coral walls surrounding them, the group was fully prepared to face unknown danger. Despite the fact that they had not seen any monster moving through this area from the top of the Leviathan's spine, either Sunny nor Nephis truly believed that no one was going to attack them in this strange region of the labyrinth. There were too many ways for the nightmare creatures to hide themselves, and if there was one thing the sleepers had learned during their time on the Forgotten Shore, it was that everything here was either deadly or concealing something capable of killing them. In that regard, their first encounter with the carnivorous worms was especially traumatic. However, their common sense turned out to be wrong this time around. The wasteland was quiet and empty, completely void of any signs of life. The absence of monsters was, in theory, supposed to make Sunny feel better, but he felt even more nervous than usual instead. This whole situation reeked of danger. It was strange and unnatural. If even the monsters were afraid to approach this place, what were they doing walking deeper and deeper into the wasteland of their own free will? Were they fools not to turn around and run away immediately? Soon they reached the point where the walls of the labyrinth had crumbled into dust. Now, there was nothing but a vast expanse of gray sand between them and the hill crowned by the giant tree. Nothing could hide on that ashen flat. However, they would also be unable to conceal themselves from anyone's gaze. Sunny glanced at Nephi's. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Changing Star scowled and lowered her chin. Then, looking forward, she scowled and said, "Let's go." Chapter 62 Hide and Seek. As soon as they left the familiar confines of the labyrinth and stepped into the vast expanse of the ashen wasteland, Sunny felt strangely uncomfortable. It was as though he had unknowingly turned slightly agoraphobic while traveling through the complicated madness of the Crimson Maze. He had grown accustomed to being surrounded by tall walls of coral, with endless tangled paths stretching in all directions for as far as he could see. Despite the fact that the labyrinth was hiding numerous dangers, it also offered a strange sort of safety. At least in the case of Sunny, who had the advantage of being able to see beyond its twists and turns thanks to his stealthy Shadow Scout. Now, with gray sand beneath and nothing to break the line of sight, he had lost that advantage. The idea of not being able to hide from the enemy made him feel naked. Keep cool. There's no one here. That thought, which was supposed to calm him down, had the opposite effect instead. Indeed, there were no nightmare creatures anywhere in the desolate wasteland, but why was that? What made them so eager to avoid this place? Nephis was walking in the front of the group, with Sunny right behind her. The Echo was in the rear, moving at a slow pace. He looked around and, after a bit of hesitation, said in a low voice, "I don't like this." Nephis glanced at him with her usual indifferent expression. Turning away, she simply said, "Stay alert." They continued forward in silence, sand squeaking under their feet. A dozen or so minutes later, Changing Star raised her hand, gesturing them to stop. Turning to Sunny, she asked, "Has your shadow noticed anything?" He shook his head. "No. There are some irregularities here and there, like small knolls or shallow pits, but nothing is moving. Mostly it just seems flat and lifeless." He turned to Cassie and asked hesitantly, "Do you hear anything?" In some cases, her keen hearing was more effective than his shadow sense. When they were caught by the Strom, Cassie had been able to sense that something was wrong long before her seeing companions noticed anything. However, this time it was of no use. She simply shook her head, indicating that there were no unusual sounds around them. Nephi sighed and lowered her head, thinking. Then she cast a gaze at the distant ashen barrow. "Let's continue." However, she did change the direction of the group slightly, aiming to approach one of the knolls that Sunny had noticed. By the time they approached it, it was already noon. The sun was right above their heads, making their shadows small and shapeless. Sunny's own shadow had returned and was now hiding beneath his feet, looking like a formless blob of darkness. This time of day was its least favorite. Nephi summoned her sword and slowly approached the knoll, trying to determine its nature. There was nothing remarkable about it except for the fact that everything around was flat, and it was not. The knoll was about as tall as Sunny, somewhat oblong, and covered in the same gray sand as the rest of the wasteland. It didn't seem dangerous, but there was no harm in checking, well, most likely. Maybe it could provide them with some useful information. Just as Changing Star was about to stretch her hand and touch the surface of the knoll, Sunny's shadow suddenly noticed something moving in the distance, back at the edges of the labyrinth where they had come from. Acting on instinct, Sunny jumped toward the Echo and hissed to Neph, "Hide!" At the same time, he dismissed the hulking scavenger. Suddenly losing her mount, Cassie flung her hands up and fell. Catching her in the Princess Carry, Sunny darted toward the knoll and lowered himself to the ground, placing the blind girl between himself and crouching Nephis. Changing Star put one hand on Cassie's shoulder and looked at him with a silent question in her eyes. "Danger?" Sunny raised one hand with his palm open, telling her to wait. His shadow was already peeking from behind the knoll, carefully observing the source of the movement. Already some distance away, the dead walls of the labyrinth rose from the gray sand. Suddenly, one of them collapsed, knocked over by a massive figure. Surrounded by the cloud of ash and sand, the figure moved forward, stepping onto the flat surface of the wasteland. 8 legs, 2 terrifying bone sides, black and crimson carapace that looked like ancient armor that had been splattered with blood, another centurion. Sunny silently cursed. They fought these monsters twice before, and won both times. However, that was because each battlefield had been carefully prepared to stack advantages in their favor, with plenty of planning and devious scheming on their part. He wasn't sure that they would be able to kill one in a direct confrontation, at least not without suffering serious damage. Turning to Nephi, Sunny whispered, "A carapace centurion had just walked out of the labyrinth." She scowled. Cassie, meanwhile, lightly touched his hand and asked, "Where is it heading?" Sunny blinked, then concentrated on the shadow's vision. Soon, he exhaled with some relief. "Looks like it's heading for the Ashen Barrow. If we stay hidden behind this knoll and it doesn't change course, there's a high chance that it won't notice us." Changing Star thought for a second, and then nodded. "Keep an eye on it and tell me as soon as something changes." Trying to become as small and silent as possible, the 3 of them pressed their bodies to the knoll. There wasn't a lot of space to hide, so they had to endure being cramped against each other. Well, maybe endure was not the right word. Sunny might have even enjoyed the situation in other circumstances. "What are you thinking about, fool? Concentrate on the deadly monster," he thought angrily, berating himself. But it was so hard to concentrate with Cassie's soft body pressed against his. Deadly monster. Finally able to get his mind out of the gutter, Sunny sighed and focused on observing the centurion. The hulking creature was moving through the wasteland, slowly drawing closer. Soon, he was able to see every crimson line and every spike on its weathered carapace. However, his eyes were glued to something else. Cautiously held between the centurion's sides, a beautiful crystal was gleaming with hypnotic inner light. It was bright and strangely alluring. A transcendent soul shard. They had already seen a similar scene, back when a pair of centurions were retrieving 2 of such crystals from the remains of the giant shark-like creature. So that was their destination. Sunny glanced at the magnificent tree standing atop the Ashen Barrow. With its onyx branches and vibrant scarlet leaves, it looked striking and majestic. Like something wholly hidden in the depths of hell. He shared his findings with the group, careful to keep his whisper as quiet as possible. The centurion was about to walk past their hiding spot. Despite the fact that there was some distance between its path and the knoll, Sunny was still nervous. This was the most dangerous moment. The monster came level with the knoll, then proceeded forward without blinking an eye. He exhaled. "It's walking toward the barrow." Nephi did not relax, still ready for things to go south at any moment. "Follow it." Sunny nodded. A moment later, his shadow slid from behind the knoll, sneakily pursuing the nightmare creature. With how much the range of shadow control had improved, he was pretty sure of his ability to tail it to the footsteps of the Ashen Hill. The centurion crossed the wasteland with the transcended shard clasped tightly between its sides. Its bearing was somewhat strange, seeming almost pious. It looked like a pilgrim walking toward a mysterious, sacred site. Soon, it approached the Ashen Barrow and suddenly stopped, as though afraid to cross some invisible line. Then the centurion carefully placed the shard on the sand and backed away from it, its eyes turned to the ground. After distancing itself from the gleaming crystal, the massive creature kneeled. Sunny had to rub his eyes to make sure that he wasn't seeing things. He wasn't. The carapace centurion bent its 8 legs and lowered itself to the ground, submissively placing its terrifying sides in front of its bowing torso. Noticing Sunny's strange behavior, Nephi raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He hesitated. "Wait." At this moment, his shadow, which was safely hidden some distance away from the kneeling monster, noticed a slight change on the surface of the ashen barrow. The bright glimmer they had seen from the top of the Leviathan's spine was back. Only this time, it was even more blinding. The glimmer rose into the air from the shadows cast by the branches of the towering tree and moved, slowly approaching the footsteps of the hill. When Sonny was finally able to discern the source of the shining, his eyes widened. Feeling a cold shiver running down his spine, he forgot to breathe. Chapter 63 Lord of Ashes. Moving through the ashen sand and piles of fallen leaves, a giant monster was coming down the hill. Sonny gulped, his expression turning dark. The creature was as large as a house, with its 8 segmented legs resembling tall pillars. Its form was similar to that of scavengers and centurions, comprised of a crab-like carapace and a protruding, somewhat humanoid torso. However, this was where the similarities between them ended. Instead of chitin, the behemoth's shell was seemingly made out of polished, lustrous metal. It was as though its whole body had been once submerged into a crucible of molten steel, emerging from it encased in an impenetrable suit of shining armor. Beams of sunlight were reflecting from the chromed surface of the carapace, creating the bright glimmer Sonny had noticed. Massive but strangely elegant, the steel monster resembled a giant knight. Sonny was ready to swear that he had noticed the shapes of 7 stars carved into its chest. However, that knight was corrupted and evil. It radiated a sinister aura, like a demon summoned from hell to sow death and slaughter. The polished armor of the creature was covered with long, jagged spikes. Its humanoid torso had 4 mighty arms, 2 ending with powerful pincers, the other 2, with razor-sharp, terrifying scythes. The demon's head was more pronounced than that of a scavenger, and crowned with several tall, sharp horns. Its metal face was almost human-like, but simultaneously repulsively monstrous and bestial. Just looking at it made Sonny's skin crawl. That thing is scary. Whatever that creature was, its rank within the Carapace Legion was clearly higher than that of a centurion, not to mention of a lowly scavenger. It was the next step in their evolution. A general or a commander, perhaps. What were they called? Legates? Praetorians? Holding his breath, Sonny watched as the Carapace demon descended from the ashen barrow. Stopping in front of the transcendent soul shard, it looked briefly at the kneeling centurion. The deadly awakened monster shrank under its gaze, as if terrified of the larger nightmare creature. Sonny knew how it felt, since he did the same when the behemoth's eyes had briefly glided past his shadow's hiding place. Not paying the centurion any attention, the Carapace demon picked up the gleaming crystal and turned around. Then, it unhurriedly returned to the shade of the giant tree's branches. Sonny slowly exhaled. "Sonny? What is happening?" He looked at Cassie, whose face was full of worry and curiosity. After hesitating for a little while, he said, "There's a new threat. Stay quiet a bit longer, I'll explain later." Back at the footsteps of the tall hill, the Carapace centurion was finally ready to stand up again. Sonny was in a dilemma. He had to follow the monster to make sure that it doesn't stumble on their hiding place on its way back to the labyrinth. However, he was also extremely curious to see what the Carapace demon was up to in its lair on the top of the ashen barrow. There was no time to think things through properly. Making a hasty decision, Sonny sent his shadow sliding over the gray sand. It masterfully avoided the Carapace centurion's eyes and was already climbing the tall hill a few seconds later. One look. I'll just take one look. Hiding in the deep shade cast by the majestic tree's scarlet crown, the shadow glided up the slope and approached the place where the Carapace demon had disappeared from its sight. On top of the hill, the ground was covered with fallen leaves. The ashen barrow was indeed larger than any high natural feature they had encountered before, vast and spacious as an actual island. However, the traces left behind by the massive creature's pillar-like legs could be easily seen. They led the shadow to the center of the island, where the obsidian tree's enormous trunk was rising from the ground, with its broad roots stretching in all directions. The carapace demon was standing beneath the tree, looking up at its lower branches. The transcendent shard was still clenched in its pincer. What is it looking at? Sunny made the shadow trace the creature's gaze and noticed several round, appetizing fruits hanging between the scarlet leaves. One of them looked especially ripe. Suddenly, the demon dropped the soul shard into the sand and, completely forgetting about it, raised its body. It stretched a pincer up and gently grasped the fruit, then pulled on it. Without any resistance, the fruit tore off the branch. Holding it as something fragile and extremely precious, the massive creature slowly lowered itself to the ground. Then, it carefully brought the fruit to its mouth and took a small bite. It's eating fruits? This abomination is vegetarian? Bewildered and not quite sure of what he had just seen, Sunny had no choice but to command his shadow to leave and hurry to the base of the hill. The time was up, and if he wanted to catch up with the carapace centurion, he had to act with haste. Gliding over the fallen leaves, the shadow descended from the ashen barrow and flew back in the direction of the labyrinth, soon catching up with the retreating monster. Phew! Feeling a lot of relief, Sunny made sure that the centurion's route would not put him on the collision course with the knoll they had been hiding behind and finally allowed himself to relax, slightly. He waited until the scythe-wielding monster was completely gone before slowly rising back to his feet. It's safe to come out now. Nephias and Cassie stood up, stretching and massaging their limbs. Suddenly remembering how tightly they were pressed against each other while hiding behind the knoll, Sunny just barely avoided turning red with embarrassment. That was a necessary measure. He was almost glad that the carapace demon had appeared at the perfect moment to take his thought away from that situation. What happened? Nephias looked at him and raised an eyebrow. For once, her expression of indifference did not look very convincing. Sunny glanced at the not-so-distant ashen barrow and shivered. There's danger ahead. We need to return to the Bone Ridge. I'll explain everything once we're safe and sound back at the camp. She opened her mouth to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent, simply giving him a nod. The trust they had built was enough for that much, at least. Sunny summoned the echo, tied the golden rope around its torso, placed Cassie's makeshift saddle back on its carapace, and helped the blind girl climb to her seat. Picking up the saddlebags, he fixed them back onto the scavenger and took a step away. They were ready to go. Before that, however, Sunny had one more thing to do. Coming close to the knoll, he used his hands to brush the sand off its surface. Soon, the onyx-black surface was revealed beneath. It was the same exact color as the bark of the colossal tree growing from the center of the ashen barrow. The knoll was, in fact, just a small portion of one of the tree's giant roots, raised slightly above the ground in this part of the wasteland. Sunny looked around, trying to calculate the size of this sea of ash. Finally, he was starting to understand what had drained all life from the giant patch of the Crimson Labyrinth. Back inside the Bone Ridge, they were sitting around the fire. The delicious smell of roasting meat filled the air, making Sunny's stomach produce embarrassing sounds. However, it wasn't time to eat yet. He was in the middle of telling the girls about what he had seen. After the centurion kneeled, another carapace creature came from the top of the ashen barrow. Only this one was not one of those we had seen before. It was easily twice the size of the centurion, 6 or 7 meters tall. I can't even imagine how much it weighs. It looked like a moving house. Nephias frowned, clearly not happy to know that there was such a behemoth barring their way. What's more, its carapace is not made of chitin. Instead, it looks like some strange metal alloy. I don't think we'll be able to cut through it. I also didn't notice any gaps in that monstrosity's armor, not even around the joints. Cassie gulped, turning her head to her friend. Changing Star, however, remained silent. Sunny sighed. In addition, that thing has 4 arms instead of the usual 2, a pair with pincers and a pair with scythes. They're even bigger than the centurion's. Its carapace is littered with spikes, and it has long horns on its head. It also looks, more human-like. It almost got a face, albeit an extremely ugly one. And its eyes, well, I think that it is more sentient than anything we had faced before. Nephi's was thoughtful. After a while, she said, "It is probably an awakened demon." Nightmare creatures with one soul core were called beasts, the ones with 2 cores were called monsters. 3 cores belong to a class of creatures known as demons, with devils right above them with 4 cores. Sunny gave her a nod, indicating that he was in agreement with her conclusion. Or maybe a devil. In any case, I think we should avoid that scary bastard at all costs. Changing Star stared at him, tilting her head a little. For a minute or so, there was only silence. Sunny gritted his teeth, then sighed, then blinked a couple of times. Finally, he gave her a doomed, crooked smile. "Let me guess. You want to kill it,